It is September 2008. You're Denise, 47 years old, a licensed practical nurse working rotating shifts at a mid-sized hospital in Cleveland, Ohio. You have worked there for 16 years. You are not rich, you are not poor. You are the specific American thing that exists between those two conditions, the person who has done everything the handbook said to do and arrived, at 47, at a life that is stable without being secure, comfortable without being protected. You own a small house in Garfield Heights, a suburb southeast of Cleveland, that you bought in 2003 for $112,000 with a 30-year fixed mortgage. You have $23,000 in a 401k that your hospital automatically enrolled you in 8 years ago, invested in a target date fund you selected because the enrollment form said it was appropriate for someone planning to retire around 2025. You have $4,200 in a checking account and $1,800 in a savings account that pays 1.2% interest. You have a 2005 Honda Civic with 94,000 miles on it and no car payment. You have a Visa card with a $6,000 limit that you carry a $2,400 balance on at 19.9% interest, which you have been meaning to pay down for 2 years but have not quite managed because something always comes up. You are not watching the financial news particularly closely in September 2008. You are working 12-hour shifts. You are managing a rotating schedule that means you sleep at different hours on different days and rarely have the sustained attention required to follow a developing financial story across its full arc. You know, Lehman Brothers has collapsed because it was on the radio during your commute. You know, the stock market is falling because your colleague Patricia mentioned her husband's retirement account. You do not know the mechanism. You do not know what a mortgage-backed security is or why its failure is relevant to your life in Garfield Heights. By March 2009, your 401k has lost $9,400 of its value. Your house, which Zillow now estimates at $79,000, has lost $33,000 of value on paper. Your hospital has announced a hiring freeze and suspended the employer match on the 401k. The Visa balance is now $3,800 because the transmission on the Civic failed in January and the repair cost $1,400 that you did not have. The interest rate on the card has been raised to 24.9%, not because you missed a payment, but because the card agreement contained a clause allowing the issuer to reprice at will, a clause you did not read and would not have understood if you had. Denise has done nothing wrong. She has not speculated, she has not borrowed recklessly, she has not made the choices that newspaper columnists will spend the next decade describing as the cause of the crisis. She has simply been present in the wrong position, at the wrong moment, positioned in the specific way that the American financial system positions the majority of working people, which turns out to be exactly the way that maximizes exposure to a financial crisis and minimizes the tools available to respond to one. This is not bad luck. This is architecture. Malcolm here. And what you're about to hear isn't a theory, it's a pattern. History has already run this experiment multiple times. The results are in. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Here is the question I want you to sit with. Do you believe that ordinary people lose the most in every economic collapse because of the choices they make or because of the position the system places them in before the collapse begins? Drop your answer below. I read every single comment. The standard explanation for why ordinary people suffer most in economic collapses is a story about behavior. They borrowed too much. They did not save enough. They were not financially literate. They bought houses they could not afford. They did not diversify. They panicked and sold at the bottom. They made, in short, a series of individual decisions that left them exposed, and the exposure was the consequence of the decisions. This explanation is not fabricated. Some of it is accurate for some people in some collapses. But it is radically incomplete as a structural account of why the distributional consequences of every major economic collapse in the modern era have followed the same pattern, with the losses concentrated at the bottom and the recoveries concentrated at the top, regardless of who caused the crisis, regardless of which government responded, regardless of which political party was in power when the collapse arrived. The behavioral explanation is also, not coincidentally, extremely useful to the institutions and policymakers whose decisions contributed to the conditions that made the collapse possible. If the losses were the result of individual bad decisions, then the solution is financial education and personal responsibility. If the losses were the result of structural position, the way the system is architected before the crisis begins, then the solution is structural reform, which is considerably more expensive and more politically difficult for the people who would have to pay for it. History does not support the behavioral explanation as a sufficient account. It supports the structural one. Here is why ordinary people always lose the most, not because of what they do during a collapse, but because of the position they are in when it begins. The first structural reason is the most fundamental and the least discussed. Ordinary people hold their wealth in the assets that lose value fastest and most completely during a financial crisis. And they hold it there not by choice, but because those are the only assets the system makes available to them at their income level. Wealth, at the level of the very wealthy, is held primarily in ownership stakes, equity in businesses, direct ownership of productive assets, real estate held without significant debt, stakes in private companies whose value is tied to long-term earnings rather than daily market pricing. These assets fall in value during crises, but they fall less, recover faster, and in many cases are not marked to market at all during the crisis period, meaning their owners do not experience the psychological and financial pressure of watching a number decline daily in a brokerage account. Wealth at the level of ordinary working people is held primarily in three places: a checking or savings account paying near zero real interest, a 401k invested in publicly traded equities through a target date fund, and home equity in a mortgage property. All three of these assets share a structural property that is catastrophic in a crisis. The checking account loses purchasing power to inflation without generating returns that compensate for it. The 401k is fully marked to market daily, meaning every decline is immediately visible, psychologically distressing, and because ordinary people cannot afford to wait decades for recovery, often realized as a permanent loss when the account holder is forced to withdraw or reduce contributions. The home equity is simultaneously illiquid, leveraged, and in most working-class and middle-class neighborhoods, highly correlated with local employment conditions, meaning it falls hardest in precisely the places where job losses are also concentrated. In the 2008 crisis, the wealthiest 1% of Americans held approximately 35% of the nation's wealth before the crisis and approximately 37% after the recovery. The bottom 50% held approximately 2.5% before and approximately 1% after. This redistribution did not happen because wealthy people are smarter or work harder. It happened because the assets they held were structurally insulated from the worst of the crisis, while the assets ordinary people held were structurally exposed to it. The second structural reason is that ordinary people are employed, and employment is the first casualty of every economic contraction. This seems obvious, stated plainly, but its implications are not always examined carefully. The wealthy derive their income primarily from returns on capital dividends, interest, rents, business profits. Capital returns are reduced in a crisis, but they are rarely eliminated entirely, and the capital itself, the ownership stake generating the return, remains. The wealthy become less wealthy during a crisis. In most cases, they do not become dependent on a monthly paycheck that may or may not continue. Ordinary people derive their income from selling their labor to employers who are themselves subject to the economic pressure of a crisis. When revenues fall, employers reduce costs, and the largest cost in most businesses is labor. The sequence is mechanical and it is fast. Crisis begins, business revenues fall, employers reduce headcount. Ordinary people lose income. They draw down savings to cover living expenses. They stop contributing to retirement accounts. They fall behind on mortgages. They accumulate credit card debt at high interest rates. The crisis converts their already thin financial buffer into an obligation that compounds against them. In every documented recession of the post-war era, unemployment has risen fastest among the lowest income quintile of workers and slowest among the highest. This is not because low-income workers are less productive. It is because they are disproportionately concentrated in the sectors retail, hospitality, manufacturing, construction, whose revenues are most immediately sensitive to economic contraction, and because they are the most recently hired, the least protected by contractual arrangements, and the most easily replaced when conditions improve. In the 2008 crisis, the unemployment rate among workers without a college degree peaked at approximately 11%. Among workers with a college degree, it peaked at approximately 5%. Among workers in the top income quartile, it peaked at approximately 3%. The crisis hit everyone. It hit everyone very differently. The third structural reason is that ordinary people borrow at retail rates and the wealthy borrow at wholesale rates. And in a crisis, the cost of debt becomes the mechanism of destruction for one group and the mechanism of opportunity for the other. Denise's Visa card charges 24.9% interest. The bank that issued it borrows from the Federal Reserve at a rate that, during most of the post-2008 period, was between 0 and 0.25%. The spread between those two numbers, the distance between what the bank pays for money and what it charges Denise for the same money, is the profit margin of the consumer credit industry, and it is extracted most efficiently from the people who have the least alternative access to credit. Large corporations and wealthy individuals borrow at rates that would be unrecognizable to anyone who has ever carried a credit card balance. Investment-grade corporate bonds issued during the post-2008 period carried interest rates of 2 to 4%. Jumbo mortgages for luxury properties carried rates only marginally higher than conforming mortgages for modest homes, despite the larger absolute loan amounts. Margin loans secured by stock portfolios carried rates of 1.5 to 3% during the near-zero interest rate period. The wealthier you are, the cheaper it is to borrow, and the cheaper it is to borrow, the more of your income you retain rather than transferring to a lender. In a crisis, this differential becomes acute. Ordinary people carrying expensive consumer debt find the interest compounding against them at the moment their income is most vulnerable. The wealthy, carrying cheap institutional debt against appreciating assets, find their debt burden actually manageable and, in some cases, find the crisis itself an opportunity to borrow cheaply to acquire assets from distressed sellers. The Federal Reserve's decision to cut rates to near zero in 2008 and again in 2020 was intended to stimulate the broader economy. Its most immediate and direct beneficiaries were the borrowers with access to wholesale credit markets, which is to say, not Denise. The fourth structural reason is that ordinary people cannot afford to be patient, and patience is the primary mechanism by which financial losses are recovered. Every piece of standard financial advice given to ordinary investors contains the same core instruction. Do not panic sell, hold through the downturn, the market always recovers. This advice is correct as a description of long-term market behavior. It is functionally inaccessible to the majority of people who receive it, because it assumes a financial buffer, savings, alternative income, assets that can be liquidated without long-term cost, sufficient to cover living expenses for the duration of the downturn without touching the investment portfolio. Denise does not have that buffer. When the transmission fails in January 2009 and the repair costs $1,400, she does not have the option of drawing from a reserve account while leaving her 401k untouched. She has a 401k and a checking account with $4,200 and a credit card with a $6,000 limit. The transmission gets put on the credit card. The credit card balance compounds at 24.9%. By the time the market recovers in 2013, Denise has not recovered with it because her 401k contributions were reduced during the hospital's hiring freeze, because her card balance consumed income that would otherwise have gone to rebuilding savings, and because the house in Garfield Heights, now worth $71,000, is still carrying a mortgage whose remaining balance exceeds its market value. The wealthy can be patient because they have reserves. The reserves allow them to wait. Waiting allows them to recover. The structure of their wealth creates the conditions for its own preservation. The structure of ordinary people's finances creates the conditions for the opposite, a cascade of small forced decisions, each individually rational given the constraints, that collectively produce a permanent loss of ground that a simple instruction to be patient does not address and was never designed to address. The fifth structural reason is the one that operates slowest and damages most permanently. Ordinary people do not benefit from the rescue. Every major financial crisis in the modern era has been followed by a government and central bank response designed to stabilize the financial system. The response has, in every documented case, disproportionately benefited the holders of financial assets, which is to say, the wealthy, while the direct benefits to ordinary people have been smaller, slower, and more conditioned on circumstances. In 2008 and 2009, the United States government committed approximately $700 billion under the Troubled Asset Relief Program to stabilize financial institutions. The Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet by trillions, purchasing mortgage-backed securities and treasury bonds to push asset prices higher. The direct benefit of these interventions to ordinary homeowners was the Home Affordable Modification Program, which was projected to help 3 to 4 million homeowners modify their mortgages and ultimately assisted approximately 1.7 million, a fraction, of the roughly 10 million families who lost their homes to foreclosure. Between 2006 and 2014, the stock market, which bottomed in March 2009, had fully recovered its pre-crisis peak by 2013 and had more than doubled it by 2017. The median American household wealth, which fell from approximately $140,000 in 2007 to approximately $82,000 in 2013, according to Federal Reserve data, did not recover its pre-crisis level until approximately 2016, and the recovery was uneven, with households in the top income quintiles recovering faster and more completely than those at the bottom. The rescue stabilized the system. It did not restore the position of the people most damaged by the system's failure. These are different outcomes. The distinction is in the data. It is simply not in the language used to describe the rescue at the time it is announced. Denise is still in Garfield Heights. The house is worth more now than it was in 2012. The Cleveland market has recovered partially, and she has paid down the mortgage through 16 more years of monthly payments. Her 401k recovered and grew. She is 63 years old. She is still working, 3 years past the retirement date her target date fund was designed around, because the combination of the 2008 losses, the years of reduced contributions, and the compounding credit card debt from the years when income and expenses were most out of alignment left her retirement calculation shorter than she had planned for. She did not make catastrophic decisions. She did not speculate or borrow recklessly or ignore obvious warning signs. She was positioned, before the crisis began, in the specific way that the American financial architecture positions the majority of working people with income tied entirely to employment, wealth held in the most crisis-sensitive assets available at her income level, debt at retail rates, no buffer sufficient to allow patience, and access to a rescue that was designed primarily to stabilize the system rather than to restore her position within it. The pattern that produced Denise's outcome in 2008 produced the same outcome in 1929, in 1973, in 1987, in 2001, and in 2020, the names change. The specific crisis mechanism changes, the distributional result does not. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial or investment advice. The structural conditions described here are drawn from documented historical data on wealth distribution, unemployment patterns, credit market pricing, and the distributional effects of government crisis responses across multiple economic cycles. The pattern is not hidden. It is in the Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances, published every 3 years. It is in the Bureau of Labor Statistics unemployment data broken down by income quintile. It is in the Congressional Budget Office analyses of the distributional effects of crisis-era fiscal and monetary interventions. The information is public. The picture it paints is consistent across every crisis in the modern record. History Meets Economics does not traffic in outrage. Outrage is easy and it changes nothing. What the record shows is a structural pattern, the same positions, the same exposures, the same cascade of forced decisions, the same rescue that stabilizes the system and leaves the most damaged people to find their own way back. Understanding the structure is the beginning of the only response to it that the historical record suggests has ever worked. The pattern is already in motion. Whether you find it useful to understand it before the next iteration depends entirely on whether you are willing to look at it clearly. I'm Malcolm, and this is History Meets Economics. Subscribe now. If you think this documentary is wrong, explain where. If you think it's right, explain. Here's another moment where history met economics.